Thanks, Ian. Hello, everyone. My name is Uwe. I'm working with Care International. Happy to meet you all on this session, which is around preparedness for accountability to affected people as a challenge for Nexus programming. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how we in Care prepare to fulfill those obligations we have to ensure the dignity of crisis-affected people, and also to use our power responsibly during crisis responses. I hope the technique will work. Yes, perfect. So I just wanted to give you some background why this is also particularly important for what I do in Care, because I'm working as the monitoring, evaluation, and accountability coordinator in our humanitarian programs. Therefore, I'm somewhat the custodian of our accountability standard that we have in Care in humanitarian programs across the world. That standard aims not only to promote accountability amongst power holders and duty bearers in our programs, but also actually to establish our own accountability to populations we work with as a central element of our organizational culture and practice. So we really want to model accountability ourselves, and therefore feedback and accountability mechanisms are very critical elements in our programs and in all programs, not only in our humanitarian programs. And so the actions that we require across our programs is to have integrated resource feedback and accountability mechanisms, and that those feedback mechanisms and accountability mechanisms have been developed with the participation of the impact population and are able to report, especially feedback and distinguish, basically have this sex and age disaggregated data on that as well. So that's the very basic actions that are required in Care. This comes against the background of a Care approach that we call social accountability, developed over the last 15 years or so, and that we under which we have developed or adapted and adopted a number of programmatic approaches to promote social accountability between duty bearers and rights holders. That include community scorecard. You probably have heard about that, especially for accountability of service providers to their clients, social audits, where community members assess the performance of duty bearers and power holders, and also the changes that they make. Budget monitoring is another building block here. This is about citizens' voice and participation in budget formulation, etc. Citizens' charters are part of our programming in various forms. That is, basically building and agreeing on quality standards and on mechanisms how those will be monitored. Last but not least, we also have local governance performance assessments that can be used as self-reflective tools for public servants, also to see, and to compare with the feedback they're getting for their performance. With regards to particular gender perspective to all these mechanisms and approaches, we have put more emphasis over the last 5 years or so, especially in our humanitarian programs, but not only, related to a stronger voice and leadership of women and girls. And therefore, we work in all those approaches that you have seen We seek partnerships with women-led organizations, social movements, also to improve and strengthen women-led advocacy through those mechanisms, and to address and change harmful social and gender norms, and ultimately, hopefully, make those systems more gender transformative. In practice, as you can see already, and you heard already, those programming approaches related to social accountability and women and girls' voice and leadership do often cross over, if we can call that nexus between conflict, humanitarian crisis, and development settings. So none of those approaches is specific to a context, although obviously there needs to be adaptations. And in humanitarian responses, we know a number of adaptations that we have implemented so far, different spaces of dialogue that we usually create and manage and moderate between disaster-affected people and power holders, with a particular attention to be inclusive here, and extend that also really to an inclusive humanitarian monitoring that starts from the needs assessment, post-distribution monitoring. We have developed what we call rapid accountability reviews, and we also replicate and adapt community scorecard now to the context, to humanitarian contexts. And with regards to gender and emergencies, and related to women's and girls' voice and leadership, we have developed also the rapid gender analysis that we're implementing now basically in all our humanitarian programmings. We follow the minimum commitments of technical sectors, and we have some specific initiatives around women lead in emergencies and life free from violence. The latter is related to prevention and protection against gender-based violence. So that's just to show you how broad we see accountability in our programming, accountability to the communities, and we think especially accountability to affected people, crisis affected people, therefore requires specific preparedness actions across all our programs. Also recognizing that increasingly we do so-called development programming, although that distinction increasingly is in my opinion very flawed and not very helpful. But let's say there's more and more development programming actually in crisis affected settings, especially because many of most crises are now protracted. They are more than 9 years. I think in 2019 the average was also 9 years plus of the crisis for which we have humanitarian appeals, etc. So therefore preparedness is a collective effort of our development programs and humanitarian programs, and they include crisis modifiers. I will come to all of that. Rapid gender analysis, I mentioned that already. Establishing feedback and accountability mechanisms across our programs. Post-distribution monitoring, there are some specific preparedness actions around that. Community scorecard, as I said already, as an adaptation in humanitarian settings, and then specifically rapid accountability reviews to ensure that we are actually achieving what we want to achieve with all those mechanisms. Let me go to the first one, crisis modifiers. I just have to say I still can't find a lot of guidance around crisis modifiers. Maybe that's something we should look at that as a community, because we believe in CARE it's an important mechanisms to allow for flexibility and timely support, especially for locally driven humanitarian responses. And therefore, there needs a lot of work to go into identifying those trigger indicators that are needed. We have to negotiate with donors. We had that discussion this morning, how well donors are prepared to help us with accountability to affected people. And therefore, that question also goes to development donors, sometimes from the same government, their development agencies, donor agencies, and humanitarian agencies in parallel, and they don't necessarily talk to each other, and their crisis modifiers would be an aspect to discuss with both sides. We need particular tools to monitor the crisis modifiers. We have to identify the data sources, and we have to work with specialized agencies in some cases to actually do the monitoring itself. So that's the preparedness actions that need to be done, and they need to be done before a crisis hits, obviously. Next would be rapid gender analysis. There's a lot of guidance now available how to do that. It's recognized as an important tool or approach, allowing for more gender-sensitive and transformative humanitarian programming. It follows those 3 questions, very basic ones that you see here. What are the preparedness actions? Having data together, we call that gender in brief, that are already available around gender-specific issues in the context of that country, in context of specific crisis in that country. We also should always think prior to a crisis already how we will actually use the rapid gender analysis, so how we will basically implement that, and we can learn also from previous RJs how well that has been done. And so some learning also here needs to be done, and therefore we think more preparedness is needed to have more interagency coordination so that RJA findings actually do support and enhance gender responsiveness of the humanitarian sector. Sorry, there's something missing. Feedback and accountability mechanism, I'm not going to go much into that, but I just want to mention that what we see quite often is that discussions around standard operating procedures, roles and responsibilities, especially also with regards to interagency joint mechanisms, start when a crisis hits. Obviously, all that can be done before a crisis, between crises, and should continue also as we learn more about the efficiency and effectiveness of existing feedback and accountability mechanisms. Other preparedness actions relate to the integrations with other programs and development mechanisms, because feedback and accountability mechanisms, as we discussed this morning, require respect and trust and confidence, and that is a longer term process, and therefore if those mechanisms are built already during development phases, it's easier to make them efficient during crisis. One tool I want to mention here is the Rapid Information Communication and Accountability Assessment, which is such an easy thing to integrate into needs assessment overall, but again, quite often is forgotten, because that's an important source of information for the design of feedback and accountability mechanisms. And again, we can discuss before a crisis hits in the clusters in various forms, how to integrate that into the assessments, in the needs assessment, but also how to integrate that with other routine interactions we have with communities anyways. Post-distribution monitoring, obviously, it's an action that happens during a crisis, but all the data requirements and data management SOPs, questions about also, how to manage identification of participants, records of distributions, etc., interoperability of databases, etc. All that can be done before. Also discussions in clusters about specific sector-specific post-distribution monitoring. All that should be done much earlier than when a crisis actually has started already. I see a question around whether crisis modifiers are different from disaster risk reduction. Yes, it is, Andrew, because crisis modifiers are something that allow for more flexible use of resources that come from development programs. It's sometimes kind of how to say, also called contingency planning or contingency plans, although that is not exactly the same. As I said before, there's not much really good operational guidance around crisis modifiers, and maybe your question just shows that we really need more discussion and more operational guidance how to use crisis modifiers in development programs to prepare for crisis responses. Community scorecard, there are some adaptations and in particular to adapt that methodology during a crisis. It is really heartbreaking for me to see that these kind of methodologies stop when a crisis hits, although obviously quite often they are established for very basic services like health, education, and others. Therefore, it is important that while we implement community scorecards in our development programs, understanding and expecting to some extent also that the service might move into crisis mode at one point, that we need to see how we can adapt that also during a crisis. And accountability reviews is something we do very regularly in our development program, in our humanitarian programs, but a lot of preparation and relationship building can go on already during development periods, and therefore it's important that they are also part of our development programming. I want to stop here. That was very fast, and I see we are already quite advanced in our programming. I would like you now, and yes, the presentation will be shared, and there's a lot of links also in the presentation. I'm not sure exactly how it will be shared. You can also write to me at any time. I will put my email address into the chat in a minute. But Ian, if you can put into the chat now exactly the link, please go to menti.com and use that code that you see in the chat to look at those two. There are two questions around ranking. One is about what is the importance that you see for those different preparedness efforts, and also overall in the system. But then secondly, specifically for you or for your organization, for your own interests, which of those accountability mechanisms and the preparedness around those actions you feel is most relevant or interesting for you? I will share the Mentimeter. Oops, sorry. quickly just change this. Okay, I don't see any responses yet. So if you can go to menti.com, there are some results coming in. Number one, first result, okay, it's changing, is moving. So this is about preparedness efforts. So basically the level of investment that is needed, and then the importance with regards to making our humanitarian programs more accountable. So we see rapid accountability reviews, feedback and accountability mechanisms as the most important one. Oh, now it's clustering much closer together. Interesting. We have 11 responses so far. More would be interesting. It's clustering very much together. Okay, interesting. I mean, it's interesting that RECA, the number 2, the Rapid Information Communication and Accountability Assessment, is considered to be relatively high effort. In my view, it is very much less effort. It's probably the easiest, lowest investment. For me, that's a quick win, actually. I would consider that really as a quick win. What do you preparedness effort, Aisha, as I said, it's around the investment basically that is needed to make it happen, let's say. Sorry if that was not clear. It's not the current status, but really, you know, the level of investments. Sorry, yeah. Okay, there is already, maybe some are going already to the second question. I would quickly have a look at that. So most relevant or interesting, we see feedback and accountability mechanisms, obviously quite broad, rapid accountability review, community scorecard. I like that because I feel there is a lot of work that can be done and lost potential in adapting community scorecards to humanitarian programming, especially in protracted crisis. Then comes RICA, rapid gender analysis that just switched place, crisis modifiers, post-distribution monitoring. Okay. I don't know whether it's possible to open microphones. I'm happy to also answer some questions. Yeah, sorry about that, Alex, if that was not so clear. Let me just go back to the first question around the effort needed and the importance, feedback and accountability mechanisms, highest important and highest level of effort. But a lot, you know, fairly clustered together. It's a little bit surprising for me. I have done that with other audiences and it was much more spread. But obviously, I think individually you probably might have voted these things or ranked these different things quite differently. There are no questions from the audience. Also in the chat, in the Mentimeter. Are you setting much commitment investment on accountability in the development side of care as on the humanitarian side? As far as accountability, as our own accountability goes, I would say no. In our development programs, we put a lot of emphasis on social accountability, inclusive governance, good governance, whatever you want to call it, with some of those models and approaches that I have shown you, community scorecard, for instance, social audits, etc. But not that much as we probably do in humanitarian programs as far as our own accountability to the populations we work with. And that's something we want to change. Therefore, we have now firmly established this accountability standard as one of 10 program quality standards. It's quite critical and important to us, and more effort is now going on into all our programs to establish accountability to the populations we work with much more firmly, also in development programs. What are the key challenges of accountability in humanitarian programs versus development? It's interesting. But I think it is a little bit of a question of culture. The accountability discussions in humanitarian programs have been quite high profile basically since the mid-90s. That's when I started to work in the humanitarian sector in Rwanda after the disaster there. Yeah, one more minute. And so it's a very high profile discussion with all the problems of actually making progress that we also discussed this morning already. But the core humanitarian standard obviously has provided a clear standard, which is good, which is not there in development programs. And maybe it's time to adopt the CHS or something similar in our development programs as well. But it's definitely a question also about investment, first in the discussion as such, but then also into actually making changes, which I feel is also not that strong in the development sectors.
Uwe, that was a fantastic presentation, and in my opinion, even better answers. To come up with them on the fly like that was absolutely superb. We are very, very close to the end of our session. Are there any other bits you need to address?
Yeah, we'll put my email address in the chat. You can reach me anytime, and I'm also part of the task force 2 of the ISC on accountability to the affected people, and I hope to continue some of those discussions in those platforms as well. And yes, we will try to see really how we can share that broadly. But if you also want to reach me already in this CHS exchange, write me a message. You can find me under people on the left side of your screen, and just send a personal message to me, and I can with your email, and we can see how to get that presentation to you without overloading our email systems.